She heard a strange noise coming from the tank and decided to stop. But what she saw inside changed everything. See how one decision turned her life upside down. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Maggie Holt had long ago stopped counting the miles she had driven, the gas stations she had passed, or the sunrises she had watched bleeding across the endless horizon. 10 years behind the wheel of a freightliner could turn anyone into a creature of routine, and Maggie had embraced that routine like armor. At 47, she had grown used to the solitude, to the low hum of the engine that drowned out memories she never invited, and to the comforting predictability of the open road. It was a rhythm she understood, one that never betrayed her the way people once had. Her day always began before dawn, when the desert was still cold and the silence felt almost sacred. She made coffee in a small metal mug dented from years of being tossed into the passenger seat. She drank it slowly, always with the door of the truck slightly open to let in the crisp morning air, as if it might clear something inside her. Her home was a modest house on the outskirts of a Nevada town most people only recognized as a place to refuel. It had peeling paint and a yard that refused to grow anything but stubborn weeds. But to Maggie, it was enough. She didn't need more. Or at least, she had convinced herself she didn't. The road had become her refuge after her marriage fell apart. 10 years earlier, she'd caught her husband in the final, undeniable act of betrayal, and the pain of it had carved out something hollow inside her. She left him, left their home, left the life she'd built brick by brick, and fled into the one place she felt she could still breathe. The highway. The freight company took her in, trained her, handed her the keys to a truck much too big for her small frame. But Maggie learned quickly. It turned out she had always been stronger than she allowed herself to believe. Her freightliner was old but loyal, a silver rig with chipped paint, and a humming engine that she cared for with almost maternal vigilance. The truck was her shelter, her co-worker, and her shield from the world. Not many people understood that kind of bond, but Maggie didn't need them to. She was content to live her life measured in rest stops and state lines, content to let her loneliness settle into something familiar instead of something painful. On the morning she set out for Arizona, the sky was still a deep navy, just beginning to soften on the edges. It was her favorite moment of any trip, the breath of quiet before the world woke up. She checked her cargo, signed off the loading sheet, and took her time during the pre-trip inspection. She always did. Her hands moved with precision over valves, hoses, latches, and bolts. She ducked under the truck, ran her palm along the lines, checked every connector twice. Drivers joked she treated that truck better than she'd ever treat a man. She never bothered to correct them. This particular route stretched across long desert miles, through open land, where cell service disappeared, and gas stations felt like rare oases. Maggie liked those stretches best. It was where she felt most herself. The stillness of the desert sun, the hum of tires over road seams, the steady roar of wind clashing against the cab. Those were the sounds that made her heartbeat feel steady. She merged onto the interstate, letting the freightliner settle into its usual rumbling rhythm. Hours passed without interruption, until something unfamiliar pierced the steady noise, the faintest metallic knock, tucked somewhere beneath the driver's side. At first, she dismissed it as loose cargo shifting in its crates, but the second time she heard it, it came with a subtle vibration that raised the small hairs on her arm. She lowered the radio and listened more intently. There it was again. A sharp, precise tick, almost like metal tapping metal from inside the truck's underbelly. Strange, she thought. Nothing in the maintenance log suggested a part nearing its end. She had driven enough years to recognize the difference between a mechanical hiccup and something foreign. But she pushed the thought away, telling herself the road was bumpy, the desert unforgiving, and old rigs made strange noises all the time. Yet the sound didn't fade. It grew bolder, more insistent. When she hit a patch of uneven asphalt, the tick returned. Not louder, exactly, but more certain. Like something knocking for attention. By the time Maggie approached a rest stop, the sun was blazing high overhead, and the temperature had climbed so much the air shimmered. She pulled in with a slow sigh, rolling her shoulders to ease the stiffness from the long drive. Parking the truck, she stepped out, squinted at the ground, and decided to take a look underneath. She always trusted her instincts, and today they were whispering that something wasn't right. She slid beneath the Freightliner on her back, the gravel digging into her shoulders. With one hand, she held a flashlight, sweeping it over the pipes and fittings. Everything looked normal, until something caught her eye. A seam along the auxiliary fuel tank, faint but irregular. Too clean, too fresh to be from the original manufacturing. It was welded. Recently. Suspiciously. Maggie narrowed her eyes, moving the flashlight closer. Around the tank's access panel were thin scratches, straight and evenly spaced, as if someone had used a tool with practiced precision. The residue around the edges had a slightly different sheen, something chemical rather than oily. Someone had tampered with her truck. Her heart thudded once hard, uncomfortable. The desert air suddenly felt heavy, dense. She scooted out from under the rig and sat there in the gravel for a long moment, wiping sweat from her brow. This wasn't a mechanical failure. It wasn't age. This was deliberate. She replayed the past couple of nights in her mind, especially the last one she'd spent on a dim truck stop miles behind her. She remembered a shadow near the trailers, a shape that lingered for a moment too long. She had assumed it belonged to another driver coming back from the restroom. Now, she wasn't so sure. Maggie stood up and rubbed her palms against her jeans. She didn't know what was inside the tank now, but she knew one truth with absolute clarity. If someone had slipped something into her truck, she needed to find out before the wrong person stopped her on the highway, before someone accused her, before she unknowingly drove a load that could ruin her life. She retrieved her tools from the compartment behind the cab. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline. She was angry, violated, in a way she hadn't felt since the day she found out about her husband's betrayal. Suddenly, that same sense of helplessness flared, but Maggie refused to let it take hold. She would not be a victim. Not again. She knelt beside the tank, disconnected the auxiliary line with practiced precision, making sure the pressure was bled off. Then she took a thin cutting tool and pressed it to the welded seam. The metal responded with a faint hiss as it began to give. Diesel fumes grew stronger, stinging her nose. She continued until she'd opened a narrow enough gap to peek inside. She lifted the flashlight again and froze. Inside the tank, submerged partially in fuel, were several tightly wrapped rectangular packages, each sealed in a way she recognized from too many crime documentaries. Thick, watertight, deliberate. Drug runners used packaging like that, high-grade, uniform, designed to survive extreme conditions. A cold sweat prickled down her neck. "Oh God," she whispered, staring into the dark cavity. She knew what this meant. If she had been stopped earlier, if a random inspection had pulled her over, the officers wouldn't have found a confused trucker. They would have found a woman transporting enough illegal substances to put her away for decades. Her breath came shallow, and she forced herself to step back from the truck, gripping the metal frame to steady herself. Her mind raced. Someone had used her. Someone had chosen her truck, her route, her life as a shield for their crimes. All the miles she had driven, all the lonely nights when she fell asleep trusting that no one would bother her. She felt betrayed by the very path she'd clung to for safety. Her fingers trembled as she pulled her phone from her pocket. She stared at the emergency number on the screen, waiting for the resolve to solidify. Finally, she pressed dial. The 911 operator answered calmly, and Maggie forced the words out. I think there are illegal packages in my fuel tank. I didn't know someone must have tampered with it. I need help. I need someone here now. The operator instructed her to step away from the truck, to keep a safe distance, and to wait where she could see approaching officers. The moment the call ended, Maggie felt the ground beneath her shift, not literally, but in the way her life tilted into unfamiliar territory. A world she had always kept at arm's length was suddenly closing in around her. Within minutes, police vehicles pulled into the rest stop, lights flashing against the red desert stone. Officers approached her with cautious professionalism. She raised her hands instinctively, though they never asked her to. They inspected the tank. Then they called in narcotics. Men in gloves and masks carefully removed the packages, confirming what she already suspected. MDMA, in quantities that made even the seasoned officers shake their heads. Her freightliner was taken for evidence. An agent asked for her license, her logs, her registration, every document she had. Another informed her that she'd need to answer some questions. She followed them numbly. Her truck, the backbone of her life, sat there cordoned off, surrounded by flashing lights. And for the first time in years, Maggie did not feel in control of her road, her day, or her destiny. As the sun dipped toward the horizon and the officers continued their work, Maggie stared at the freightliner that had always felt like home. It looked distant now, almost unfamiliar. She wondered what would become of her, what accusations might come, and how a life so steady could collapse in mere hours. She did not yet know it, but in the midst of her fear and uncertainty, someone was about to step into her life. Someone who would change its course just as surely as the welded seam on her tank had. Someone who would listen. Someone who would care. Someone who would shake loose the loneliness she had learned to wear like second skin. But for now, Maggie sat alone on the curb, wrapped in the fading desert heat, watching the last rays of sun paint the world gold and rust. And she wished, not for the first time, that she didn't have to face everything in her life by herself. She just didn't know yet that she wouldn't. The evening air had cooled by the time the officers finished collecting evidence, but Maggie barely noticed. Her mind drifted in slow, heavy circles as she sat on the curb with her arms wrapped around herself. Her freightliner, her anchor to the world, now stood behind police tape, like a stranger waiting in judgment. She kept replaying the image of those packages floating in the diesel tank, the silent accusation hiding in a place she had trusted completely. The flashing lights finally dimmed, the officers dispersed, and with each minute that passed, the world seemed to retreat further away from her. She didn't know how long she sat there before a quiet voice near her broke through the noise in her head. "Ms. Holt?" She lifted her gaze slowly. Standing a few feet away was a man she hadn't seen earlier, tall, composed, the kind of person whose presence seemed to stabilize the air around him. His hair was threaded with gray, his shirt neatly tucked beneath a vest that bore the insignia of the State Transportation Safety Bureau. He wasn't intimidating like the narcotics officers, or brisk like the uniformed patrolmen. Instead, he approached with the calmness of someone who understood what shock looked like and knew exactly how to move in its presence. "I'm Thomas Kellner," he said gently. "I'm with the Bureau. May I sit?" She nodded, because speaking suddenly felt like too much effort. He lowered himself onto the curb, leaving enough space not to intrude yet close enough to be present. For a moment, neither said anything. Maggie watched the darkening sky. Thomas watched her, but not in the analytical, assessing way she had grown used to from law enforcement. His expression was one of quiet concern, the look of someone gathering patience rather than conclusions. "You've had a difficult day," he finally said, not as an observation, but as an invitation. Maggie swallowed, her throat tight. "That's one way to put it." He nodded with understanding, and the simplicity of his response lent her a small measure of comfort. He didn't ask her to explain, didn't demand details, didn't press. Instead, he sat with her through the silence, as though that, too, was part of his job. When she finally spoke again, her voice trembled with exhaustion. "They used my truck," she said, staring at the asphalt. "They used me." Thomas took in her words before answering. "Yes, it appears that way." She shut her eyes briefly, the reality sinking deeper. "I didn't know. God, I didn't know anything about it. But what if someone stops me on the road? What if they think I'm involved? What if I—" He raised a hand just slightly, a gesture meant to steady, not silence. "You're not under suspicion. We know tampering when we see it. You did the right thing calling in." Maggie let out a shaky breath. "Feels like I'm being ripped out of my own life." "I know the feeling," he said quietly, surprising her. She looked at him then. Really looked. There was a softness in his features that didn't come from inexperience, but from having lived through something difficult himself. He didn't elaborate yet, and she didn't ask. Instead, an officer approached and informed her that she was required to give a formal statement back at the temporary field office they had set up near the rest stop. She followed them, and for the next hour she recounted every detail: the sound she heard, the moment she crawled under the truck, the welded seam, the packages. She repeated everything until the words felt detached from her own voice. Thomas remained in the background at first, observing without interfering. But whenever she faltered, unable to find a specific phrasing, he stepped forward, not to put words in her mouth, but to slow down the process, to give her space. She noticed that the other agents deferred to him in a way that hinted he carried quiet authority. By the time the statement was finished, it was night, and Maggie felt hollow. Her truck had been towed to a secure impound facility for full forensic analysis. Her papers were taken for copying. She was left with her small travel bag and a rising dread about tomorrow. One of the officers told her she would be temporarily placed in a local motel until they determined whether she required protective supervision. The phrase alone made her stomach tighten. She imagined herself as a character in a crime movie, except she didn't feel brave or cinematic. She just felt tired. A car was sent for her, but before she climbed in, Thomas approached with the same quiet presence as before. "Ms. Holt," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I'll be overseeing the liaison between your company and the investigation. I want you to know we're going to get to the bottom of this." She almost laughed, not with humor, but with a kind of disbelief. "You say that like you mean it." "I do," he answered simply. "And I'll check on you tomorrow morning. You've been through a shock. No one should navigate this alone." The sincerity startled her. She had grown used to solving every problem in silence, wrapped in the safety of her own independence. But tonight, that independence felt like a fragile, cracked shell. She nodded once, more grateful than she could express. The motel was small and clean enough, though the room smelled faintly of old carpet and disinfectant. The bedspread's pattern of faded flowers felt like it belonged to a place stuck in time. Maggie set her bag down and stared at the bed, uncertain whether she would sleep or spend the night pacing. She was barely inside for 5 minutes when her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "If you need anything at all, don't hesitate. TK." For a moment she stood still, touched by the simple gesture. She saved the number. She didn't reply. Sleep came in short, fractured pieces. She dreamt of the fuel tank splitting open, the packages rising like ghosts. She woke several times listening for the metallic tick that had haunted her on the road. Each time she reminded herself the truck wasn't here. It wasn't even hers at the moment. By morning, her thoughts drifted toward what would happen next. Would her company keep her? Would this mess stain her reputation? The trucking world was small, and rumors traveled faster than trailers on an open highway. She tried to push the worry back, but it clung to her like dust on her jeans. A knock at the door startled her. She peered through the peephole and saw Thomas standing outside, holding 2 cups of coffee. Maggie blinked, confused by the wave of relief that washed over her. She opened the door. "You're here early." "I figured you probably didn't sleep well," he said, offering her one of the cups. "Most people don't after something like that." She accepted it carefully, the warmth seeping into her palms. "You didn't need to come." "Maybe not," he replied, "but that doesn't mean I shouldn't." His words caught her off guard. He didn't smile, didn't flirt, didn't push. He was simply present. And in a world where most people were in a hurry to move on, his presence felt grounding. He asked if he could come in, not assuming anything. She nodded and stepped aside. He didn't inspect the room the way officers sometimes did. Instead, he sat in the chair near the window, giving her the bed and the comfortable distance she needed. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Maggie exhaled. "Like someone threw a grenade into my life." "That's an honest answer," he said. "Better than pretending everything's fine." "You sound like you've been through something similar." Thomas looked out the window for a moment, gathering words as if choosing them carefully. "I lost my wife in an accident 5 years ago. Wrong place, wrong time. A trucker fell asleep on the wheel, drifted into traffic and—" He paused, but his voice remained calm. "After that, I left the police department. I couldn't keep working cases that reminded me of what happened. I moved to transportation safety because I thought, maybe, just maybe I could prevent someone else's tragedy." His confession landed softly, without self-pity. Maggie felt something shift inside her, an empathy she wasn't prepared for. She didn't know what to say, but he didn't seem to expect a reply. Instead, he leaned forward slightly. "We reviewed the tank and packaging late last night. What was hidden there wasn't random. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. They knew your route. They knew your schedule." Her breath caught. "So they targeted me on purpose?" "It appears so," he said. "But we're going to find out why." Maggie stared into her coffee. The idea that strangers had tracked her movements made her skin crawl. She had always taken comfort in the relative anonymity of her job. Now, that illusion was cracking. Thomas continued, his voice steady. "We'll keep you under observation for now. Not because you're in trouble, because you're a witness, and we take care of our witnesses. How long will that last?" "As long as necessary," he said. Then, after a pause, "And as long as you need." Those words stayed with her long after he left to return to the field office. She had never expected kindness from someone in his position. Most investigators were brisk, mildly suspicious, and distant. Thomas was different. He talked to her like a person, not a problem. Late that evening, after assisting with another series of interviews, Maggie returned to her motel room exhausted. The keys jingled in her hand as she reached the door. The hallway was quiet, the kind of silence she usually found comforting. But something about it felt wrong tonight. She noticed the faintest shift in the air inside her room as soon as she stepped through the doorway. Then she saw it. Her notebook. The one she kept zipped inside her bag. It now lay open on the bed, open to a blank page in the middle, as though someone had carefully flipped through it and chosen that spot deliberately. Her pulse spiked. Someone had been inside. Someone wanted her to know it. The air left her lungs in a single panicked breath. She backed out of the room and called Thomas immediately. He answered on the second ring, and his voice changed the moment she explained what she saw. "Stay where you are," he ordered, the calm giving way to a threat of urgency. "I'm on my way." He arrived within minutes, faster than she expected, and swept into the room with a caution that told her he was both trained and deeply concerned. He checked the door, the lock, the windows. Nothing was broken. Whoever came in had used a key or had the skill to bypass the lock entirely. Thomas straightened slowly, his jaw tight. "They wanted you to know they can reach you. This is intimidation." Maggie felt her stomach coil. "So what now?" "Now," he said, his voice low and fierce, "we move you somewhere safer. You're not staying here another night." He didn't hide his worry. And though she didn't say it out loud, his reaction, his fear for her, did something inside her chest she hadn't felt in years. A warmth, a sense of being protected, something she had long stopped expecting from anyone. As he guided her out of the room, one thought kept repeating in her mind. She wasn't facing this alone anymore. And she wasn't sure whether that scared her more or brought her the first fragile sense of hope she'd felt in a decade. The next morning dawned pale and heavy, as though the desert sky itself felt the strain of the night before. Maggie woke inside a different room, this one in a protected housing unit used for witnesses and vulnerable civilians. It wasn't luxurious, but it felt more secure. The windows had reinforced locks, the door had an internal bar, and an officer remained posted at the end of the hallway. Still, Maggie slept poorly, roused by every small sound, every creak of the building settling. The image of her notebook lying open on the motel bed haunted her mind with cold, clawing fingers. Someone had been inches from her things, her life, her privacy. Someone had wanted her unnerved. Thomas arrived early, his expression clouded with a seriousness she hadn't seen before. He checked in with the stationed officer before knocking softly on her door. When she opened it, coffee in hand and exhaustion in her eyes, he studied her face for a moment, reading the lingering fear she couldn't quite hide. He didn't comment on it. Instead, he offered her a gentle nod, a gesture that somehow provided more comfort than a string of consoling words ever could. "You slept here, that's good," he said quietly. "This place is monitored. No one comes in or out without credentials." "I guess that should make me feel better," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "It will," he said. "Eventually." He stepped inside when she motioned him in. She had expected him to bring papers, or updates, or another round of questions, but he simply stood with his hands lightly clasped in front of him, as if deciding where to begin. He had the aura of someone carrying more knowledge than he was immediately willing to share, not out of secrecy, but out of caution for how she might take it. "Last night changed the direction of this investigation," he said finally. "Whoever came into your motel room wasn't just trying to scare you. They were sending a message to us." "To you?" she asked, startled by the implication. "To the investigation," he clarified. "They know we're close. Close enough that disrupting or intimidating you might buy them time. That means they're aware we've been connecting the dots." "And what dots are those?" Maggie asked. Thomas exhaled slowly and sat in the same chair he'd claimed the day before. She settled onto the edge of the bed. It felt surreal, sitting across from a man who had stormed into her life only days ago, and yet somehow she found his presence grounding rather than intrusive. "We found similar tampering on at least 9 other trucks in 3 states, he explained. Same tools, same technique, same kind of packaged contraband. Different drivers, different companies, but the pattern is consistent." She felt the room tilt slightly. 9 others? 9 confirmed, he said. Possibly more. Not everyone inspects their tanks as thoroughly as you do. Some cases have gone unnoticed. Some drivers disappeared. Her breath caught. Disappeared? He nodded solemnly. 2 missing person reports matched the profile. Drivers who were en route to isolated stops. Their rigs were found abandoned, loads intact. No signs of them. We're not sure yet whether those cases connect directly, but it's too close for comfort. The words hit hard, like a cold wind through an open window. Maggie gripped her coffee cup tighter, the ceramic warm against her palms. Her world had always felt dangerous in a broad, abstract way. Accidents, weather, exhaustion. But she had never imagined being woven into the fabric of something predatory and calculated. Who would do something like this? She whispered. People who know the trucking system inside and out, Thomas answered. Someone with resources. Someone who studies routes, habits, fuel stops. Someone who knows when a driver is alone. She shivered involuntarily. We believe they use a van, he continued. White, older model. Same one spotted at several locations where similar tampering occurred. It always shows up between 2 and 4 a.m. It never stays long. Cameras never catch the plates. Maggie's spine stiffened. I remember a white van. Not clearly, but at that truck stop, 2 nights before everything happened. A shadow near my rig. Thomas's eyes sharpened slightly. Every detail you remember is important. He didn't pressure her. He didn't push. He simply let the memories surface in their own time. That was becoming his pattern, letting her lead where she could, stepping in only when absolutely necessary. She found herself appreciating that more than she expected. As the day progressed, Thomas escorted her to the field office, where investigators were piecing together hours of surveillance footage. Some of it was grainy, some almost useless, but they combed through it with methodical precision. When they paused on a clip showing an indistinct figure moving between trucks at night, Maggie leaned in, trying to determine if the posture or gait felt familiar, but the footage was too poor to be certain. Yet her stomach twisted at the thought of someone slipping like a shadow between vehicles, choosing victims with clinical detachment. By afternoon, an idea had formed among the investigators, a risky one. They needed someone who could identify the figure if they caught him in the act. Someone who had seen him, even in passing. Someone the network had already marked. Maggie. Thomas argued against it. She overheard fragments of the tension outside the door, his voice low and intense. She didn't catch every word, but the sentiment was clear. He didn't want her exposed again. His concern warmed a place inside her she had tried to keep cold for years, and yet she knew from the tone of the other agents that they believed her involvement could break the case wide open. When Thomas returned, his expression was taut. He sat across from her, rubbing the bridge of his nose before meeting her eyes. "They want you to help with an operation," he said. "What kind of operation?" she asked, though she already guessed. "We're planning a controlled setup," he explained. "A decoy truck identical to yours. Same make, same color, same company markings. We'll position it in a remote rest area, equip it with internal surveillance. Then we wait. If the van shows up, we arrest the suspect on the spot." "And you need me there," she said softly. "Yes," he admitted. "You're the only one who's seen the suspect clearly enough to make a positive identification." She let the silence settle between them for a moment. The idea of stepping into danger made her chest tighten, but beneath the fear was something else, anger. Not at herself, not even at the investigation. At the people who had invaded her life, used her truck, dragged her into something criminal and terrifying without her consent. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. Thomas's eyes flickered with emotion, worry, admiration, reluctance. "You don't have to. We can try without." "No," she interrupted. "I'm tired of being scared. I want this over. And if I can help stop them from doing this to someone else, I won't walk away." He studied her for a long, quiet moment. Then he nodded with resigned respect. "All right. But I'll be there the whole time. You won't be alone." His words sent a strange warmth through her, unexpected and unsettling in its tenderness. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. 2 nights later, the operation was set. The decoy truck looked eerily like her own, down to the small scratch near the passenger side door. Seeing it brought a strange ache, as though she were looking at a ghost of her life. Agents hid surveillance equipment inside the cabin and cargo hull, tiny cameras embedded into the edges of the fuel tank. A black van that served as the command post was parked a short distance away, its lights dimmed, its occupants whispering over radios. Thomas guided her up the steps into the van, his hand hovering near her back without touching, as if he wanted to offer support, but respected her space too much to assume it. Inside, screens flickered with multiple camera angles, each showing the decoy truck from a different vantage point. The air was thick with quiet tension. Hours passed. Midnight bled into early morning. The desert wind whispered across the asphalt outside, and the rest area remained still. Maggie felt her nerves tightening, every muscle coiled beneath her skin. Beside her, Thomas remained steady, his presence like a weight keeping her anchored. At 3:47 a.m., one of the surveillance operators stiffened. "Movement," he said sharply. Maggie's heart leapt into her throat. A white van rolled into view, faded paint, dent along the side, windows darkened. It stopped near the decoy truck with deliberate slowness, the headlights dimming as if the driver didn't want to draw attention. A figure emerged, tall, hooded, moving with the same quiet confidence Maggie remembered from that distant truck stop. Her pulse hammered violently. "That's him," she whispered. Thomas's hand closed gently but firmly around hers, grounding her. "You're safe here," he murmured. Agents tensed at their stations. Radios crackled with whispered commands. The air grew razor-thin. The man approached the decoy truck, glancing once around the empty rest area, then crouching by the fuel tank. He pulled a tool from his pocket, a cutting instrument, narrow and specialized. He lifted it toward the welded seam. "Now," the lead agent ordered. Lights exploded. Officers swarmed the rest area from every direction, shouting commands. The suspect tried to run but collided with 2 agents blocking his path. He twisted violently, but was forced to the ground, pinned and handcuffed in seconds. His tools scattered across the pavement, gleaming under the glare of headlights. In the surveillance van, Maggie's breath finally released in a shaky exhale. She hadn't realized Thomas was still holding her hand until he squeezed lightly, reassuringly. She turned to him, meeting his eyes, and for a moment neither spoke. The intensity of the moment wrapped around them like a cocoon fear, relief, exhaustion, something deeper neither dared name. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She nodded, though her voice had deserted her. The operation was over. The suspect was caught. The network behind him would begin to unravel as investigators traced his contacts, his equipment, his routes. But for Maggie, the shift was more profound. The danger was still present, but she had faced it. She had stepped into the darkness willingly and emerged standing. Thomas remained beside her long after the van's monitors went dark and the agents dispersed. They sat together in the quiet aftermath, 2 people who had survived something that bound them in ways neither yet understood. Outside, the faint glow of dawn began to rise, washing the horizon with light. And for the first time in years, Maggie felt something stirring within her that resembled hope, not fragile, not fleeting, but forged in the heat of fear and courage. She wasn't alone anymore, and she suspected she no longer wanted to be. The morning after the arrest broke warmer than the nights that came before it, as though the desert itself acknowledged that something heavy had finally lifted. Maggie stepped outside the protected housing unit for the first time since the operation, her body still buzzing with the residue of adrenaline, fear, and something gentler layered beneath. The air smelled faintly of dust warming under sunlight, of sagebrush stirred by a light breeze, and for the first time in days, she felt she could breathe fully. The danger had not entirely vanished. She knew enough about the criminal world now to understand that networks didn't crumble overnight. But one of the people responsible for turning her life upside down had been caught. Justice had shifted, even if only an inch. Thomas waited for her by the car he had used throughout the investigation, leaning against the hood with one foot crossed over the other. He wasn't wearing his badge on the outside of his jacket today, and without it, he looked more like an ordinary man than a federal agent. It caught her off guard how human he seemed in the soft morning light, how approachable, how almost gentle. She had grown accustomed to the controlled seriousness he carried like a second skin, but now there was something quietly relieved in his posture, as though he too had spent the last days living under the shadow of uncertainty. When she approached, he straightened. "You ready?" he asked, and she could tell the question had more layers than the surface suggested. "I think so," she replied with a small exhale. "Or as ready as I'll ever be." He opened the passenger door for her. She hesitated for just a second before climbing inside. Riding in a car instead of her truck felt unfamiliar, a reminder of how much the last days had pushed her outside her routine, her carefully controlled world. Thomas circled to the driver's side and settled behind the wheel with a quiet sigh that mirrored her own. They drove in silence for a while, the road stretching long and golden ahead of them. The investigation's primary tasks were not yet done, but the biggest danger, the one that had threatened her future, her safety, her freedom, was no longer lurking in the shadows. Agents were already tracing the suspect's contacts. More arrests would follow, Thomas had told her, though cautiously, as if he didn't want to promise too much. "What happens now?" she asked, after several miles passed. "We take you to the station first," he said. "You'll give a final statement. Then they'll release your truck once the evidence team finishes documenting it." "Will it still feel like mine after all this?" she asked quietly, more to herself than to him. He glanced at her briefly. "I think so. Trucks tend to become part of the people who drive them. And you're stronger than what happened to you." His words sank into her, steady and warm, and something in her chest eased. She didn't respond right away, not because she didn't have thoughts, but because the honesty in his voice made her throat tighten unexpectedly. When they reached the station, everything moved with procedural efficiency. Officers greeted Thomas with nods. Some recognized Maggie and offered her reassuring smiles that didn't feel patronizing. She gave her final statement in a small room with a glass window, her voice steadier than she expected. They walked her through the paperwork, and though the sheer formality of it all tugged at her nerves, knowing Thomas was only a few steps away gave her an anchor. Finally, an officer escorted her outside to where her Freightliner waited in the secured lot. When she saw it, her breath caught. There it stood. Her truck, battered but proud, streaked with desert dust and lit by the rising sun. She had expected to feel fear when she approached it again, but instead, she felt something closer to recognition. This rig had carried her through storms, sleepless nights, miles of solitude, and a decade of rebuilding herself. It was more than steel and bolts. It was the one constant in her life. She touched the door handle, letting her hand rest on the metal for a long moment before climbing inside. The cabin smelled faintly of her old coffee thermos and the lavender air freshener she'd hung months ago. It still felt like hers. Still, the shadows of fear lingered along the edges of her thoughts. She slid her hand over the steering wheel, as though greeting an old friend, grounding herself in familiarity. Thomas approached from behind, pausing at the door. "How does it feel being back in it?" "Strange," she admitted. "But good. Maybe better than good." "You don't have to go back out there immediately," he reminded her gently. "You can take some time." She considered that. For years, the road had been her sanctuary, the place where she ran when she didn't want to feel or remember. Now, after the danger she'd faced, it felt different. Not smaller, not tainted, but changed. Like she needed to relearn it. Or maybe relearn herself. "I think I'll take a few days," she said. He nodded, accepting the answer with the quiet support she was slowly learning to appreciate. As they walked back to the car together, neither spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable now. It was a space where thoughts could settle without pressure. Later that afternoon, as Thomas drove her back to her house at the edge of town, she watched the landscape roll by the rust-colored rocks, the scattered shrubs, the highways she knew by heart. Every mile felt like a slow exhale, a release of tension she had carried for too long. Her house looked the same as when she left it. Faded paint, stubborn weeds, a wind chime that clinked softly in the warm breeze. But stepping out of the car this time, she realized she felt differently about it. For the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like the place she hid from the world. It felt like a place she might rebuild. Thomas followed her to the porch, reluctant to leave before making sure she was settled. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and after a moment, she turned back to him, leaning against the frame. "I'm not sure what I would have done without you," she said honestly. He shook his head lightly. "You would have managed. You're tougher than you think." She smiled at that, the expression soft and unfamiliar on her face. "Maybe. But still. Thank you." His gaze held hers, steady and earnest. "I'm not going anywhere." The words caught her off guard. Warmth wrapped around her ribs, not destabilizing this time, but comforting. She didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. Over the next days, the rhythm of her life began to shift. She didn't return to driving right away. Instead, she allowed herself to rest, something she hadn't done in years without guilt gnawing at her. She spent afternoons sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the highway in the distance. She cleaned the house, not because it needed it, but because it felt like reclaiming something. And Thomas visited, not every day, not in a way that made her uneasy, but often enough that she began to expect his knock, his voice greeting her with gentle steadiness. They talked more. Not about the case, not always, but about their lives. Maggie told him things she hadn't shared with anyone in years, the pain of her divorce, the loneliness she carried, the strange comfort she found in miles of pavement. And he shared pieces of himself, too. His childhood in a small town, the moments that pushed him into law enforcement, the fears he rarely admitted even to colleagues. Their connection grew quietly, without fanfare. There were no dramatic declarations, no sweeping gestures. Just two people who had walked through danger side by side, discovering that companionship didn't have to strike like lightning. It could appear as softly as dawn, easing over the horizon. One evening, as they sat on the porch beneath a sky shimmering with stars, he reached out and brushed his fingers lightly against the back of her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over and allowed his fingers to settle into hers. The moment was simple, but it felt monumental. She was no longer a woman living solely in the shadow of solitude. She was someone stepping into something new, something tender and hopeful. She didn't know where life would take her next, whether she would spend another decade driving or whether she would choose a different path altogether. But she knew She no longer faced the world alone. The criminal network would collapse, and the danger that had once circled her life would fade into the past. Her truck would wait for her when she was ready. But now, for the first time in years, she found herself imagining a life that wasn't defined by escape, but by connection. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the desert wind brushing softly against them. For Maggie Holt, the road was still long. But now, at last, she knew she didn't have to walk it alone. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Watch the next videos, check out the others on the channel, and share this one with someone who might like it.